I was just cleaning my mum's basement, nothing dramatic. Then I found a gift box, no label, no dust. Inside was a Polaroid of a boy who disappeared 6 months ago. A boy I used to teach. 5 minutes later, the police were at my door, and everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, started to unravel. I hadn't been back to my mother's house in over a year. The last time was Easter, and even then I'd only stayed for a night, sleeping on the old pull-out couch and leaving before the sun came up. But now she was recovering from surgery, her left knee replaced and wrapped in layers of gauze and pain meds. I packed up my car in Nashville, made the drive back to our small Tennessee town, and told myself I could handle a week. Just 1 week. The house hadn't changed. Same creaky porch step, same chipped bird bath in the yard, always a little tilted, no matter how many times I fixed it. My mother, thinner than I remembered, greeted me with a smile too wide and a voice strained with pride. "Didn't think you'd come," she said, half joking. I smiled back, said nothing. By the second day, she was sleeping most of the time. The medication made her groggy, disoriented. She'd nod off mid-conversation, then wake up unsure what month it was. I stayed busy. Did the dishes caught up on lesson planning started sorting through the basement, something I'd avoided for years? The basement was the kind of place memory clung to. Same smell of dust and rust, old furniture draped in sheets, boxes marked with years, 2002, school stuff Christmas, old lights, Dad. I didn't plan to open them all. I just wanted space to stack new supplies, maybe carve out a corner where I could set up a desk. It was behind a row of paint cans that I found it. A box, shoe-sized, wrapped like a gift, though the paper was faded, the corners soft. No tag, no name, just sitting there like someone had left it behind in a hurry. I hesitated. It didn't make sense my mother hadn't hosted a birthday or Christmas here in years. I picked it up, weighed it in my hands. Light, quiet, no sound of shifting contents. I carried it upstairs to the kitchen, set it on the table, and peeled the wrapping away. Underneath was a plain white box, the kind used for photo storage. I lifted the lid. Inside was a Polaroid photo. My heart stuttered. Jalen. He was sitting at a desk, chin propped on his hand, that half smile on his face. The photo was old, worn at the edges, but it was unmistakably him. Same striped shirt, same dimples. I knew that smile better than I wanted to. I'd taught Jalen in 3rd grade. He disappeared 6 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon just after lunch, walked out of school and never came back. No trace, no note, nothing. And here he was in my mother's basement. I reached for the second item in the box, a piece of construction paper folded once. I opened it. Crayon lines, scribbles, and then I saw it, our secret. I'd taught Jalen how to draw a beaver once in the corner of his math worksheet. It had become our thing. He'd draw it next to his name on every assignment, a goofy little creature with buck teeth and a lopsided tail. Nobody else knew what it was supposed to be, but he always made me smile, and there it was, drawn in green crayon next to the words, "You said I was good at this." My hands were shaking. I sat down the chair, screeching against the floor. The box was still open in front of me. The kitchen was quiet, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of my mother's bed upstairs. I didn't know what I was looking at, why the photo was here, why this drawing, something so specific, so intimate, had ended up in a basement no one had touched in years. I picked up my phone. 911. What's your emergency? My voice broke. I cleared my throat. I need to speak to a detective. I think I found something related to a missing child case. They took my name. My address told me to stay put. A car was on the way. It didn't take long. Within the hour, a cruiser pulled into the driveway, and moments later, a woman stepped into the kitchen. Tall, black blazer over a grey t-shirt, hair pulled back, eyes sharp. "Allison Myers," she said. "Yes, I'm Detective Ramirez." Isla Ramirez. I knew that name. Everyone did. She'd been on the news during the early days of the Jalen investigation. Calm under pressure, relentless. Some parents called her cold. Others said she was the only one who cared enough to keep the case alive. She looked at the photo, then the drawing, then back at me. Where exactly did you find this in the basement? Behind some paint cans. I was cleaning. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just nodded slowly, lips tight. Did you show this to anyone else? No, just you. She placed the items into an evidence bag, labelled it, tucked it into her folder. Then she sat across from me. You said you taught him yes. 3rd grade. He was quiet, kind, loved to draw. I haven't seen that picture in years. I don't know how it ended up here. She studied me, her gaze steady but not accusing. Not yet. Did your mother know him? Not really. I mean, I might have mentioned him, but she wouldn't. I stopped, thought about it. Had I ever talked about Jalen at home? Maybe, maybe not. We'll need to speak with her, Ramirez said. She home upstairs, recovering from surgery. She's not very coherent right now. Ramirez nodded again, wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked at me, eyes narrowed just slightly. Alison, I'm going to ask you to stay in town for the next few days. We're going to reopen the case. I nodded, still trying to catch up. We might have just found our first real lead. Ramirez stood up, tucked her pen into her blazer pocket, and gave me a look that landed somewhere between professional concern and quiet calculation. Do you mind coming down to the station just to go over what you know while it's fresh? I said yes before I even thought about it. Something about her presence made it easy to comply, firm but not forceful. The kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make things move. At the station, they offered me coffee, which I declined. The interview room wasn't dramatic, like in TV shows, no dark lights or mirrored glass, just beige walls and a faint hum from the air vent. Ramirez came in with a folder and a legal pad sat across from me, like we were two people catching up at a coffee shop. Let's start simple, she said, flipping open her notes. Tell me about Jalen. I took a breath. He was in my class last year, 3rd grade. He was quiet at first. A little withdrawn, but respectful. Smart. He liked science. He was obsessed with weather systems for a while, drew hurricanes on everything. I paused, let myself smile at the memory. Eventually, he warmed up to me. Drew me little cartoons in the margins of his homework. He had this habit of looking out the window when it rained, like he was waiting for something. Did he ever talk about his family? I frowned. Not much. I knew he lived with a foster family. He never said anything bad about them, just not much at all. He was like that. He held things close. Ramirez nodded, scribbled a note. Did you have contact with his guardians a few times? They came to conferences. Polite, distant, like they were checking a box. And the day he disappeared, May 14th. A Tuesday. He was in class, ate lunch, went to recess, then vanished sometime between recess and art class. No one saw him leave. The cameras were down for maintenance. I remember thinking that couldn't be a coincidence. Ramirez looked up. You reported a concern, didn't you? Something about a woman outside the school? I blinked. I did, a week before he disappeared. A woman came by during pickup, said she was a relative, asked what class Jalen was in. I told her I wasn't allowed to give that information. She left, but something about her stuck with me. Did you describe her? Yeah, in the report, mid-30s, brown hair, soft voice, southern accent. Wore a denim jacket, I remember that. I watched Ramirez's expression, but she gave nothing away. She leaned back. We couldn't confirm her identity at the time. No matches. We canvassed the area, pulled DMV photos, nothing. She paused. But the drawing you found, that little beaver sketch, that wasn't public. No way someone could have faked that unless they knew the boy well. I nodded slowly. It was our thing, which makes the photo and the drawing significant. It suggests whoever placed that box in the basement knew Jalen personally. Possibly Jalen himself. That thought hit me in the chest. I hadn't considered that. Could he have left it? Could he have come here? But why? When she continued, I'd like to ask your mother a few questions. I hesitated. She's not well. The pain meds make her groggy. She's confused half the time. Ramirez closed her folder. Then we'll tread lightly. Back at the house, the lights were dim. My mother was in her recliner blanket over her lap, remote in hand. She looked up as we entered, eyes narrowing when she saw the badge. Mrs. Myers Ramirez said gently, "Just a few questions, if that's all right." My mother glanced at me, then back at Ramirez. "About what? About a box your daughter found in the basement." "Oh, that old thing she said too quickly. I thought it was just trash." Ramirez kept her tone even. "Did you put it there?" "No." A pause. "Maybe." "I don't remember. There's a lot of junk down there. The photo inside. Do you recognize the boy?" My mother shook her head. "No, I don't think so. Allison, you know I don't go down there much." I watched her face, the tightness around her mouth, the way her hands clenched the blanket. She was lying, not with malice, but out of fear. And that was worse, somehow. Ramirez didn't press, just thanked her, turned to me. "We'll be in touch." Back at the door, she lowered her voice. "She's hiding something." "You know that," I nodded. "She's always been like that, withholding. I'm reopening the case, full scale. We'll re-interview the original witnesses. Dig into the old leads. Maybe something cracks." I swallowed. "You think Jalen's alive?" "I don't know, but someone wants us looking again. And that means something." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the pull-out couch staring at the ceiling. I kept hearing Jalen's voice soft and careful, asking questions in class. I kept seeing that little beaver drawing, a secret code between a boy and his teacher, and now maybe a trail. The sound of the old furnace kicking on startled me, but I didn't move. My body was still my mind, racing in loops I couldn't stop. I thought about that last week of school before Jalen disappeared. I replayed every detail I could remember: what he wore, what he said, what he didn't say. It was all locked in now, permanent, like something etched in stone. But back then, it all just felt like normal days. May 14th, a Tuesday, the kind of day you forget if nothing goes wrong. It had started out like any other. Morning bell rang at 7:45. Jalen came in with his backpack slung low, head down like usual. He mumbled morning when I greeted him, then went straight to his seat in the back row. I remember he had drawn something on his folder, a crooked little cabin in the middle of trees. I joked, "Building a new summer home?" "Jalen." He smiled, but didn't answer. We did math, then reading, then broke for lunch. I stayed in the classroom that day to catch up on grading. A couple of the other kids came back early asking if they could borrow coloured pencils. I said yes, barely looking up. It wasn't until 10 minutes into the next period that I realised Jalen hadn't returned. "Bathroom," maybe one of the kids offered. I checked. Nothing. I went down the hall, peeked into the cafeteria. No Jalen. I called the office casually at first. "Hey, can someone check if Jalen's with the nurse or anything?" The secretary's voice was light. "I'll ask around." It wasn't until a half hour passed that I felt it. That thing in your chest that switches from concern to fear. We searched the school, every closet, every hallway, the gym, the playground. He was gone. Clean. Gone. No note. No backpack left behind. No jacket hanging. Just gone. Later, they told me the cameras had been down. Scheduled maintenance. Something about budget issues, system upgrades. No footage, no timeline. I remembered something else, how Jalen had been acting odd that month. He'd taken to sitting by the window, eyes fixed on the trees beyond the school fence. He kept drawing these strange houses half hidden in forests with tiny figures inside. Once he asked, "If you got lost, would anyone know where to find you?" I thought he meant in a story. I said something like, "Well, if they love you, they'll come looking." He'd nodded, like that made sense, but now I wasn't sure he believed it. And then there was the woman. She came by one afternoon the week before he disappeared. Said she was picking up a nephew. She wore a denim jacket, hair pulled back, looked nervous but polite. "Jalen's in this class, right?" she asked. I told her I couldn't share that information. She smiled, said, "Right, of course, just thought I'd check." Then she walked off toward the parking lot. I reported it, wrote it in the logbook, mentioned it to the principal. He brushed it off. Probably a misunderstanding. Maybe someone from social services doing a home check. He didn't follow up, or if he did, he never told me. I'd wanted to press harder, but it's hard when you're just the teacher. People don't listen to you like they should. You learn to pick your battles to not make noise unless it's serious. And by the time I realised it was serious, he was already gone. The police came. Questions were asked. Parents panicked. The school sent out memos, held assemblies. But the panic faded like it always does. Jalen became a photo on a bulletin board, a line in an unsolved case file. The school year ended. New kids came in. Life moved on. Except for me. I stopped drawing with my students after that, stopped letting them stay in at recess to talk. I became polite, structured, predictable. It was easier than wondering if I was getting too close. Jamie, my partner at the time, pulled away after it all happened. He wasn't cruel, just detached. Said things like, "You did what you could, and you're not responsible." But he didn't get it. He didn't hear Jalen's questions, didn't see those little pictures in the margins, didn't feel the weight of a kid trusting you with their silence. We broke up that summer. No fight, just silence. Like something had quietly finished unraveling. Now, 6 months later, lying in my mother's house, I felt all of it again. The slow horror of realising something precious has slipped through your fingers. The kind of grief that doesn't scream, it settles into your bones. And now that photo, that drawing, in my mother's basement. I turned onto my side, pulled the blanket up, and tried to breathe slowly. But I knew what this was. Not just a clue, not just a box. It was a second chance. And I didn't know if I deserved it. The next morning, I waited until my mother was settled in with her tea and her pain meds before heading back to the basement. I told her I was organising old boxes, trying to make space. She nodded without much interest, her attention already drifting to the television and the warm comfort of routine. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the cool air hit me again as I stepped into the dimness. This time, I brought a flashlight. I wanted no more guesswork. The box from yesterday was gone sealed in an evidence bag, but something kept tugging at me. One hidden thing meant there could be others. My mother was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. If she'd put something down here, she hadn't meant it to be found. I began with the shelves behind the water heater, then the bins stacked along the far wall. Old holiday decorations, my dad's bowling trophies, a broken vacuum. Then I saw the plastic tub labelled "School Drafts, Not Used." It was half buried beneath a stack of magazines and yellowed newspapers. I pulled it out, wiped off the dust, and pried the lid open. Inside were copies of the school yearbook, mock-ups and edits with notes scribbled in the margins. I recognised the layout. These had been printed before final approval used for corrections. I remembered the school cancelled the yearbook that year. Too much chaos after Jalen vanished. Parents complained, and the administration thought it best to skip it entirely. I pulled one out. Pages stuck slightly the way old ink does when it's been shut too long, and then I saw it. Page 12. A grid of portraits. Jalen's photo smiling, his eyes softer than I remembered, circled in red ink. Not neatly, but with uneven strokes. Underneath, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You still draw. I still watch." My stomach flipped. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave a dent in the paper. I flipped through the rest of the book, hands trembling slightly. Tucked between the pages were drawings. Not copies, not scans, originals. Construction paper, crayons. One had a little rocket ship with his name on the side, another a cartoon beaver holding a pencil. At the bottom, in blocky handwriting, for Ms. M. I sat back on the cold concrete floor. My hands were cold, my face warm. Something was wrong, off balance, in a way I couldn't yet name. These drawings had been in my classroom. I used to hang them on the bulletin board. After he vanished, I took them down. Some I'd kept in my drawer for months, unable to throw them away, but they were gone by the end of summer. I assumed I'd finally let them go, or maybe not. Had I brought them here in some fog of grief I tried to remember? No, I hadn't, which meant someone else did. I climbed back upstairs, my heart pounding with something between dread and disbelief. My mother was still in her chair, dozing slightly. I stood there for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall. She looked small, older than last year. Her hands, once so sharp with precision, gardening, sewing, cooking, were now curled and soft. "Mum," I said not loudly. She stirred. I found more things in the basement." Her eyes opened slowly. "Oh, drawings, yearbooks." Jalen's face circled in red. She didn't blink, just looked at me. "I don't remember those. Did you go into my classroom after he disappeared?" She frowned. "Why would I do that? I don't know. Maybe to clean, maybe to help. These drawings, I thought I lost them." She shrugged the motion tight. "Maybe someone gave them to me. I wouldn't have kept them on purpose." I stared at her, waiting for something to change in her face, but it didn't. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone refusing to engage. "Did you know him?" I asked quietly. She blinked. "Who?" "Jalen." A pause. She turned her head back toward the television. "You taught so many kids." My voice cracked. "Don't do that. Do what pretend you don't know who I'm talking about." She said nothing. I took a step back, felt something press in my chest, a mix of betrayal and sorrow, and something else I wasn't ready to name. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to accuse. I just wanted her to stop lying. That night, I called Ramirez. "I found more," I said. "Yearbook, notes, drawings that were in my classroom." There was a pause on the line. "Can I come by?" "Yes, but I don't think she's going to tell you anything. I think she's protecting someone." "Or herself," Ramirez said. "Maybe both," I thought. When Ramirez arrived, I showed her the yearbook. She examined the note carefully, took photos, bagged the drawings. Same handwriting as the box, she murmured. Same pressure. This wasn't casual. Whoever did this was holding on. To what I asked, Ramirez didn't answer. Later, after she left, I sat alone in the kitchen. I stared at the spot on the table where the box had been. I didn't know what was worse, that someone put these things here, or that someone thought I wouldn't find them. The house felt different now, smaller. Watching me. I didn't sleep again. I moved between the couch and the window, too tired to think clearly, too restless to sit still. Morning came in quietly, a pale grey that crept through the curtains like a warning. I waited until I heard movement upstairs, my mother's slow shuffle the kettle, whistling the thud of the fridge door, and then I went to her. She was at the kitchen table, buttering a piece of toast with her back to me. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said. She didn't turn around. "About what you know what?" She paused, the butter knife hovering above the bread. Then she sat slowly like someone preparing for something long overdue. I found the drawings, I said. The photo, the note, the yearbook with his face circled. She folded her hands in front of her. I didn't put those there to be found. I felt something pinch behind my eyes. But you did put them there. Silence. Then, yes. I let the weight of it hang for a moment. How did you get them? She looked up at me finally. Her expression wasn't angry. It was tired. His mother gave them to me. I blinked. His biological mother. She nodded. She came to me. Last fall. I tried to process it, but the words were slow to form. Why you? She said she'd found my name in one of Jalen's school newsletters, parent volunteer list. Said she saw I was your mother. I felt the room tilt slightly. You spoke to her and you didn't think to tell anyone she didn't want trouble, my mother said, voice quiet. She just wanted to see him. 1 hour, that's what she promised. She said she didn't want to take him, just see him from a distance. Maybe give him a note, a gift. I sat down across from her hard. And you believed her. She was his mother, she said simply. She looked like she hadn't slept in months. She was shaking, crying. She said she knew she'd messed up her chance in court, that she'd lost custody, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. I felt for her. You gave her information. My voice cracked. What class he was in? When he had recess, she looked at her hands. I thought I was helping. I thought she just needed closure. A moment, I stood up. Mum, she took him. He disappeared. For months. You don't get to play dumb about this. I didn't know she'd do that, as she whispered. I swear. She said 1 hour. I thought God help me. I thought maybe you'd be the one who saw them together. Maybe it would make peace for everyone. I turned away. I couldn't look at her. My hands were trembling and I pressed them against the edge of the counter to steady them. You risked everything for a stranger, I said, for a woman you knew nothing about. And you didn't even tell me. I didn't think you'd understand. You're right, I said coldly. I don't. That afternoon, Ramirez called. Her voice was steady, but more focused than usual. We traced a connection. A former address in Oak Hollow about 20 miles from here. The name matches Jalen's birth mother, Melanie Green. She lived there until late last year. Left no forwarding address. My breath caught. That's close. Too close, Ramirez said. We're checking Shelter's rental logs, old utilities. If your mother met her, it's likely she was staying nearby for at least a few weeks. She gave her information, I said. Jalen's schedule. His location. There was a pause. Can you confirm that she admitted it? Ramirez exhaled slowly. That changes things. I know. We'll bring her in for formal questioning soon. Be prepared. After I hung up, I stood in the hallway outside my mother's room. She was asleep again, blanket pulled up to her chin, the TV still murmuring about a baking competition. She looked peaceful, but I knew better now. I didn't know what kind of person that made me, someone who looked at her own mother and saw betrayal, but the feeling sat in my chest like stone. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by morning, soft but insistent against the windows. I sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I didn't know what I was waiting for until the phone rang. It's Ramirez, came the voice on the other end, calm, but charged with something underneath. We've located something. Possibly her. I stood without realizing. Where? A remote area outside Waycross, Georgia. A burner phone used in Tennessee last fall pinged off a tower out there. We cross-referenced a few grocery co-op purchases, small stuff, sketchbooks, canned food, bottled water. All paid in cash, no names. But handwriting on the receipts matched samples from Melanie Green's juvenile record. It's a strong lead. Is it? My throat tightened. Jalen, we can't confirm yet. But If she's there and she's been living off-grid, the odds are decent. She didn't say good. Ramirez never said more than she meant to. Can I come? I asked. No. This won't be a media event. No sirens. Just plain clothes, quiet entry, 2 teams. Is it a raid? A recovery operation, she said. But, yes, armed. I thanked her, then hung up and stood at the kitchen sink, watching the rain darken the soil outside. Something clenched in my gut and wouldn't let go. Ramirez texted an hour later. Heading in soon. We'll update. I wandered the house like it belonged to someone else. The photos on the wall looked unfamiliar, frozen versions of people I used to know. My own mother once laughing in a garden. Me, age 7, holding a snow globe. I ended up in the guest room pulling open drawers that held nothing I needed. Old linens, tax folders, buttons. I needed to move, to do something. But there was nothing left to do. By 3, my phone buzzed again. Ramirez. We're in, she said. There are 4 cabins on the property. No power lines. Propane tanks, solar, rigged. Looks like they've been here a while. I said nothing, just waited. There are 2 adults, 3 minors. One of the kids fits Jalen's description. We're approaching him now. I held my breath for what felt like minutes. Then, he's alive. I sat down slowly. The couch gave under me like a cradle. He's thin, she continued, voice more clipped now, more clinical, undernourished, alert, but distant. He recognized his name. Didn't resist. Didn't speak at first. Is he hurt? No obvious signs of trauma, just fragile. He was drawing when we entered. What I whispered. Sketches, trees, cabins. One had a small figure looking out a window. My chest tightened. We're bringing him into protective custody now, Ramirez said. Melanie Green is in custody. No struggle. She didn't try to hide him, didn't run, just sat with him until we got there. I wiped my eyes. I hadn't even noticed I'd been crying. She said I didn't steal him. I gave him a place where no one could hurt him again. I didn't respond. I'll be in touch soon. For now, let us do the intake. He's safe. That's what matters. I sat for a long time after the call. It felt like hours. The rain had stopped, but the world outside was still soaked, like it had absorbed too much and didn't know what to do with it. My mind drifted uncontrollably to the worst-case scenarios. What if he hadn't been found? What if I had never gone down to that basement? What if that drawing had stayed hidden for another year or forever? I pictured Jalen older now, his face longer, maybe thinner, his voice quieter. I imagined him curled up in a corner of that cabin, sketching the only world he knew, believing that nobody was looking for him. Or worse, that nobody cared, but someone had been watching. And I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. That night, I couldn't rest. I paced the house, touching walls, frames, doorknobs, like they were suddenly unfamiliar. I tried to imagine preparing a home for him again. Food. He'd like a bed he could sleep in, silence that didn't feel like punishment. But all of that felt miles away. He didn't know what I'd done, or what I hadn't. I sat on the edge of the bed and remembered something he once said during art class. I was helping another student when Jalen tapped my elbow and pointed at a crayon. "This colour doesn't work right," he'd said. "It's fine," I told him. "Just press harder." "No," he said. "It's tired." Now I understood. Sometimes things go quiet, not because they're broken, but because they're exhausted. Jalen had been quiet for months. Maybe now we could start to listen. The call was scheduled for 4:00 p.m, supervised by Child Services, and conducted through a secure link. I was told not to expect much. It's just a first step, the counsellor had said. Don't push, just be present. I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to reach through the screen and pull him into something safer than this sterile connection. I set up my laptop in the living room, facing the window for light. The house was too quiet, as if it too was bracing. At exactly 3:59, the screen flickered. A caseworker's face appeared first, then disappeared. And then, there he was. Jalen. He looked older, and yet exactly the same. His face had thinned out, his eyes more alert than I expected. Not scared, just withdrawn. Like someone waiting to be hurt. He sat on a folding chair in what looked like a conference room. Behind him, a white wall, a poster with a rainbow that said, "You are safe here." He didn't speak, just stared. I tried not to rush. "Hi, Jalen," I said softly. He blinked, his eyes flicked down then back to mine. "It's me, Miss Morgan, from school." He didn't answer, just held the edge of the table. "I'm really glad you're okay," I continued, careful with every word. "I've missed you. A lot of people have." Nothing. The silence stretched, but I didn't feel it. I just sat there, trying not to let my voice shake. Finally, after what felt like 10 minutes, he spoke. "Did you tell people my mum left me?" The question hit like a punch. Not loud, not accusatory, just tired, like it had been circling in his head for too long. "No," I said. "I never said that." He looked down again. "They said she's in trouble." "She is," I said carefully. "But not because of you. You didn't do anything wrong, Jalen. Not one thing." He bit the inside of his cheek. I could see the movement. His eyes were glossy now, but he didn't cry yet. "I thought she was going to come back," he whispered. I nodded slowly. "I know. And I think she meant to. But hiding you, that wasn't safe, Jalen. You deserve to be somewhere you don't have to hide." He finally looked at me, really looked. His voice cracked when he asked, "Are you mad at me? That broke something in me." I shook my head quickly. "No, never. I was scared. And I've been worried for so long. But never mad." He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Can I come back to school?" I smiled gently. "One step at a time. First, you need rest and help. People who understand how hard this has been." "I'm not broken," he said quickly, fiercely. "I know you're not," I said, "but even strong people need help sometimes, especially strong people." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "You kept my drawings." I nodded. "Everyone." He blinked hard. One tear fell, then another. He didn't sob, just let them fall. He looked so small, then despite everything he'd grown into. "I don't know where I live now," he said. "We'll figure that out, I promised. You don't have to do it alone." The screen dimmed slightly. A timer in the corner blinked red. 2 minutes left. "Can I talk to you again?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "Any time they'll let me." He nodded, then whispered, "Okay." When the call ended, I sat in the chair for a long time, not moving. My hands were clenched in my lap. I didn't cry at first, just breathed. Then it came slowly, not loud. The kind of crying that doesn't need sound, only release. Later, Ramirez called to check in. "He did better than we expected," she said. "He asked if I was mad at him." Ramirez was quiet for a second. "That makes sense. Is he really okay?" "He's functional," she said carefully. "But this isn't over. He'll need trauma counselling. Long term. Possibly residential at first. He's still piecing together what's real and what's not." "I want to help," I said. "I know. I want to apply for temporary custody when the time's right." Ramirez exhaled. "You'll have to go through the process. But I'll write a letter. So will the department, I think." After we hung up, I sat on the floor of the guest room and started writing a list. Things I'd need, things Jalen might want, extra blankets, pencils, sketchbooks, non-sugary cereal. I didn't know how long he'd be here or if he'd come at all. But I needed to be ready. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. It was the kind of building that hadn't changed in decades, peeling paint in the stairwells, flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway's benches that creaked under the weight of waiting. I sat in a quiet room with a court-appointed advocate beside me. My hands folded in my lap, a folder of notes untouched at my side. It wasn't my trial, but in every way that mattered, I felt like I was being judged. They brought my mother in first. She looked small in the county-issued cardigan, her hair pulled back loosely. She didn't look at me when she entered, and I didn't expect her to. The judge read the charges obstruction of justice and accessory to custodial interference. The language was cold, precise. It made everything sound smaller than it was. Then came Melanie Green. Jalen's biological mother wore plain clothes, her wrists still marked from the transport cuffs. She looked tired, older. She didn't speak at first, only nodded when her name was called. When the judge asked how she intended to plead, she hesitated. "Guilty," she said finally. "But I need to say why." There was a murmur from the gallery, which the bailiff quieted. The judge allowed her to speak briefly. "I know what I did," she said, voice steady but raw. "I know I broke the law, but I didn't take him to hurt him. I didn't hide him out of hate. I wanted to be his mum, just once. The right way, without people watching, without courts telling me who I could be." She looked up at me then. Our eyes met, and I didn't feel anger. I felt something closer to ache, a recognition of two women who both wanted the same child to be safe, and had both failed in some way. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand, with knees that didn't feel like they belonged to me. I swore and sat and tried to steady my voice. "I'm a teacher," I began. Jalen was in my class. He was quiet, smart. He liked to draw animals that didn't belong in Tennessee. Beavers, seals, wolves. He told me once they felt safe because they could disappear. I paused. The room was still. I didn't know he was gone until the police told me. And then I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting him. And when I found that box, part of me hoped it wasn't real, because if it was, it meant my mother had been part of it. And I didn't want that to be true. I looked at the judge, but it was, and I still can't explain why. Maybe she thought she was helping. Maybe she believed Melanie deserved one last look. But none of that makes it okay. The judge nodded, asked a few follow-up questions about my interactions with Jalen and what I hoped would happen next. "I don't want revenge," I said simply. "I just want him to be somewhere that feels safe. I'm applying for temporary custody, but if the court finds someone better, that's okay too. I want him to have choices. Real ones." Afterward, I sat back down. My legs shook slightly. I watched as my mother was led out again, eyes down. She still didn't look at me. Melanie was allowed to hug her public defender briefly. She didn't cry, just stood hands clasped as if bracing for whatever came next. The judge didn't make a ruling that day, but something in the room had shifted. We weren't enemies anymore. Just three women standing in the aftermath of too much silence, each trying in our own flawed ways to make sense of what we'd done with the love we carried. After the hearing, the silence didn't lift. It only changed shape. I went home and stared at the walls again, the framed photos, the shelves with books Jalen once borrowed during recess. My mother's house, my house now, technically felt both fuller and emptier than ever before. Fuller, with memory, emptier, with meaning. I wasn't sure what I was mourning more, the boy who had been missing, or the version of my mother I could no longer believe in. The court hadn't handed down a ruling, but the lines had already been drawn. My mother would likely avoid prison. Her lawyer was arguing for a suspended sentence, citing age, health, and lack of direct contact. But the betrayal sat in my bones like a bruise. She hadn't kidnapped Jalen, but she'd made it possible. She'd passed along the address, the schedule, the loose, dangerous trust that maybe, just Maybe a desperate woman could do the right thing if she was given one more chance. And then she hid what followed. I didn't know how to forgive that. Not yet. Ramirez stopped by a few days later, her coat still dusted with March pollen, her eyes tired in that way you don't notice, unless you know what exhaustion born of witnessing looks like. "I'm finishing my report," she said. "Thought you might want to go over some of the details before it's filed." We sat on the porch. She pulled out a small notepad but didn't open it right away. "You don't have to protect her," she said gently. "I'm not," I answered. "I just can't stop wondering how much of me came from her." Ramirez tilted her head. "That's the thing with parents. Even when we know they're flawed, we still carry their weight like it's ours." I nodded. "I keep asking myself if I should visit her." Ramirez paused. "What would you say?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe nothing." That's still something she said. A day later, I received a note from Jalen. It came in a yellow envelope decorated with a small drawing of a house with 2 windows and smoke curling out of the chimney. Inside, the paper was lined, "Careful." "Dear Miss Morgan, my counsellor said writing helps. I don't like it much, but I said I would try. If you were my mum, would you still love me if I messed up? Would you tell me the truth? Or keep it a secret? I think I messed up, but I don't know how. I just wanted to be somewhere that didn't feel bad. Sometimes I think I made everyone worse. Sorry. Love." Maybe Jalen. I read it 3 times before setting it down. Then I cried for the first time in a while, really cried. Not for me, not for my mother, but for a boy who thought survival was something to apologise for. That afternoon, I wrote back. "Dear Jalen, you didn't mess up. You were brave in ways no kid should have to be. And yes, if I were your mum, I would love you every single day, especially on the hard ones, especially when you feel messy or mad or confused. That's when love counts the most. You didn't make anyone worse. You made me better. I don't know all the answers, but I promise to always tell you the truth. Even if it's hard. Love, Allison." I didn't know if he would read it right away. I didn't expect a response, but writing it helped. The next day, I visited my mother. The facility was quiet. She sat in a recliner by the window, a lap blanket covering her knees. When she saw me, she smiled faintly. I sat across from her. "I read the report," I said. "I know what you told Ramirez." She nodded. "It was a mistake." "Which part?" Her lips pressed together. "All of it." We sat in silence. "I don't know what to do with you now," I said honestly. "You don't have to do anything," she replied. "You're doing just fine." She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. When I left, there was no dramatic goodbye, just a nod, a parting glance. Outside, the sky was wide and grey. I stood for a moment in the wind, then turned toward home. The wind had quieted by the time I got home. The house felt heavier than usual, but in a different way, less haunted, more tired. Like it had been holding its breath and was now learning how to exhale again. I sat on the couch with the envelope from the court still sealed in my hands. I knew what it said before I opened it. The sentencing hearing had concluded earlier that morning. I hadn't attended. Ramirez had, and she offered to call me afterward, but I asked for it in writing. I didn't want someone else's voice carrying the weight of what I already knew. Melanie Green Jalen's biological mother had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for custodial interference and endangerment of a minor. The prosecutor had pushed for more citing premeditation and concealment, but the judge had acknowledged the context. Her intentions, the summary read, were misguided, not malicious. Nonetheless, harm was done, and consequences must follow. I stared at that line for a long time. My own mother's sentence was lighter, 2 years suspended with mandatory supervision and psychological evaluation. She was also prohibited from any unsupervised contact with minors, including Jalen. The judge had hesitated before issuing that condition, then added, "This is not a moral judgment, Miss Morgan. This is about restoring trust." It was a strange thing seeing your family defined by bullet points and signatures, as if who we were could be filed and archived. The final page of the envelope confirmed it. The court had granted me temporary guardianship of Jalen, effective immediately. A review would follow in 6 months, then annually. I would be held accountable for his education therapy and general well-being. I was to file monthly progress updates. There would be home visits. I set the pages down and closed my eyes. Relief didn't come with tears or celebration, just a long breath I hadn't realised I'd been holding. Later that evening, Ramirez stopped by to deliver her report. She handed it over with that same even tone she always used, never theatrical, never cold, just steady. "I filed this with the department this morning," she said. "It's not for public release, but I thought you should see it." I skimmed the first few pages' summary of findings timeline involved parties. Then came the analysis. This case, she wrote, illustrates the failure of multiple systems, the blind spots in family court proceedings, the overworked nature of CPS, the limited protections for non-custodial parental figures, and the often dismissed observations of educators. It is also, paradoxically, a testament to the small redemptions possible when people act with stubborn care, even after mistakes. I looked up. "That last part, did you mean—" Me, Ramirez tilted her head. "I meant all of us. You, Jalen, even your mother. No one came out clean. But the story didn't end where it could have. She didn't stay long. No detective ever does once the case is closed. Closure isn't really part of their job." By the following week, the news had quieted. The local paper ran one final headline: "Boy recovered after 6-month disappearance. Legal proceedings. Conclude, then moved on." There were no interviews, no spotlights, just a whisper that faded like morning fog. Jalen arrived on a Thursday. A social worker dropped him off just after noon. He had a backpack, 2 sketchbooks, and a tightly folded blanket he insisted on keeping in his arms. He didn't say much, just looked around the living room, then asked where the bathroom was. I showed him. When he came out, he went straight to the small bedroom I'd set up. The one with the desk and soft lamp and a poster of a treehouse I remembered he liked. He didn't ask if it was his. He just sat on the edge of the bed and took out his pencils. I didn't hover. I made grilled cheese for lunch and left the plate on the hallway floor, then retreated to the kitchen. A few minutes later, the plate was gone. That night, as I folded laundry in the living room, I heard him from the doorway. "Miss Morgan." I turned. He wasn't crying, just holding his blanket. "Do I have to call you that?" "No," I said. "You can call me whatever feels right." He nodded, then added, "Can I just say Allison for now?" "For now is just fine." He stood there for another second, then turned and went back to his room. I stayed up late listening to the sound of pencil on paper coming from behind his door. Healing never makes headlines, but that night it was the loudest thing in the house. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us announced, but both accepted. Mornings began quietly. Jalen, waking on his own, shuffling into the kitchen in socks, always carrying his blanket, never mentioning why. I made toast and eggs. He ate slowly, chewing each bite like he was testing if the food was real. I never asked him questions before 10 a.m. It became our unspoken rule. After breakfast, he would sit by the window with his sketchbook, drawing in long uninterrupted stretches while I worked through lesson plans or laundry or silence. Sometimes I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye. Measuring. Not distrustful, just cautious, like someone still learning the rules of a place that promised no sudden moves. Therapy started that week. Twice a week, a counsellor came to the house and sat cross-legged on the living room rug with Jalen while he drew. They didn't call it therapy. They called it quiet talking. The counsellor was good, gentle, never pushing. She told me afterward that Jalen had an unusual sense of sequence, that he could recall not just events, but emotions that surrounded them, and he drew them in panels like comic strips. It's his way of managing time, she said, turning everything chaotic into something with borders. He didn't talk to me much about those sessions, but I didn't need him to. I saw it in the drawings. The first ones were black and white stark, a small boy standing in front of a dark house, a woman in the distance always half-shaded. But then the scenes shifted. A figure began to appear, a tall woman with a flashlight stepping into shadowy woods, calling out names. In one panel, she carried a map. In another, she knelt beside a frightened child and whispered something in a speech bubble too faint to read. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't have to. One night, about 2 weeks after he moved in, Jalen came into the living room just before bed. I was reading on the couch half asleep. He stood there holding a blanket, hair mussed one sock on the other trailing behind him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always." He hesitated, then sat down on the far end of the couch. "If I call you Mum, does that make you sad?" I set the book down gently. "No," I said. "It doesn't make me sad. Even if I still miss her sometimes?" "Yes," I said. "Even then." He looked down at his knees. "I don't know what to call you." "You don't have to decide now," I said. "You can call me anything you want as long as you're here." He nodded, pulled the blanket tighter. "Okay." He didn't say anything else, just leaned back until his shoulder barely touched mine. We sat there for a long time. The clock ticked. The house exhaled. Later, after he went to bed, I peeked in to check on him. He was asleep with the sketchbook open beside him. On the page, the woman with the flashlight again. But this time, she wasn't in the woods. She was at a table serving pancakes to a boy with a crooked smile. In the corner of the panel, in tiny block letters, he'd written, "Safe House." I stood in the doorway for a while, not moving. Not crying either, just breathing in the quiet. Whatever name he gave me whenever he gave it didn't matter. What mattered was that he stayed, that he drew, that he slept, that he believed even for one page that he had found home. It happened on a Saturday, the kind with light so soft it made dust look golden and the air inside the house feel like a pause in a long sentence. Jalen was outside somewhere in the backyard sketching under the dogwood tree. I had promised to help him organise his art folder, but first I decided to go through the last few boxes in the basement. Not because I expected anything new, but because I needed the space, both physical and emotional. The basement smelled like cardboard and time. I worked in silence, folding up old holiday decorations, repacking books that hadn't seen daylight in years. Near the far wall, behind an empty suitcase and a broken, oscillating fan, I found it a small, dented metal box with a rusted clasp. It wasn't locked. It wasn't labelled. It just waited. I carried it upstairs and sat at the kitchen table. For a moment, I stared at it, fingers hovering above the lid. Then I opened it. Inside, there was only one thing, a letter, folded twice, the edges worn the paper thin like skin. My name was written on the front, in my mother's handwriting, sharp, angled, familiar. I hesitated, then unfolded it. "Alison, I don't know if you'll ever find this. I don't know if you'll want to. Maybe by the time you read it, you'll hate me. Maybe you should. I don't know what kind of mother I turned out to be. I only know I made choices that can't be undone. When Melanie came to me, she wasn't wild. She wasn't dangerous. She was soft-spoken, tired, like someone who had run too long and forgotten how to stop. She said she just wanted to see her son once 1 hour, she promised. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I thought maybe if someone gave her kindness, she'd remember how to be kind too. I didn't expect her to take him. I didn't expect the silence that followed. But once it started, I didn't know how to fix it without breaking everything else. You always wanted to do things right. You still do. And I've watched you from the quiet places. How you love, how you fight, how you listen. You are the kind of woman I never figured out how to be. And that's why I'm writing this. Because I see you doing it right. And I'm proud. I don't need you to forgive me. I just need you to know that even though I failed, I saw you. I saw what you became, and I am so, so proud. Mum, I didn't cry right away. I sat there for a long time, the letter resting in my hands, like a weight I wasn't sure I'd earned the right to carry. There was no apology, not really. But there was something else, an attempt at honesty, at owning what had been broken without asking for it to be repaired. I didn't know if that was enough. I only knew it was what she left. Eventually, I